What if death is not a single moment, but a passage? Naimi and Ananhennaif, according to Vedic-inspired traditions, the days following death may carry deep symbolic meaning as the soul gradually loosens its connection to the body, the home, the people it loved, and the identity it once called me. But why does the seventh day feel so important in so many spiritual traditions? What may change by then? Can attachment weaken? Can awareness shift? Can the soul begin moving towards something beyond the familiar world? Welcome to the Soul's seventh night. Stay until chapter 7, because the deepest question is not simply where the soul may be after 7 days. It is what the soul may finally be ready to release. Chapter 1. The first shock. When the soul may still feel close to the life it left. My dear listener, imagine this for a moment. A person has spent an entire lifetime believing, this is my body, this is my home, these are my people, this is my name, this is my life. Then, in one irreversible moment, the body becomes still. The room remains, the family remains, the house remains, the photographs remain. But the person who once moved through all of it can no longer participate in the same way. Within Vedic-inspired traditions, this first stage after death is sometimes understood as a profound transition because the body may stop suddenly, but the impressions created through an entire lifetime do not necessarily become meaningless in the same instant. And this is where the mystery begins. If someone spent 40, 50, 70 or 80 years identifying with one body and one world, can that identification simply vanish in a second? Perhaps not. The physical connection may end immediately, but attachment is not physical alone. Attachment lives in habit, memory, desire, love, fear, responsibility, expectation, the feeling of mine. This is where the idea of samskaras becomes important. In Vedic-inspired thought, samskaras are deep impressions formed by experience, emotion, repetition, action, and identification. They shape the way consciousness responds, and perhaps death removes the body before every impression has fully loosened. Think of someone who leaves a home they have lived in for decades. Even after moving away, they may still wake up for a moment and expect the old room. They may still imagine the old doorway. They may still reach mentally for routines that no longer exist. Now imagine a transition far greater than moving houses. Imagine leaving the body itself. This is why some spiritual traditions describe the earliest period after death as a time when the soul may still seem inwardly oriented toward what it knew. Not because we can prove that a departed person is literally walking from room to room, but because the force of familiarity can be powerful. A lifetime has momentum. The person was a mother, a father, a husband, a wife, a child, a friend, a worker, a protector, a provider. These roles do not feel temporary while we are living them. They feel like identity itself. Then death arrives and reveals something we rarely want to think about. Every role was temporary. The body was temporary. The house was temporary. Even the name was temporary. And yet the attachment to these things may have been practiced for decades. This may be why the first shock of death within this spiritual framework is not simply about losing the body. It is about losing the world that told you who you were. The bed where you slept is still there, but it is no longer yours in the same way. The people you loved are still speaking, but you cannot answer in the ordinary way. The plans you made for next week may still be written somewhere, but you cannot complete them as before. That is a powerful image, because it reminds us that death does not only separate consciousness from the body, it also interrupts identification. And perhaps this is why spiritual preparation matters. If a person spends an entire life saying, "I am only this body," then death represents total collapse of identity. But if a person spends life reflecting, "The body is part of my experience, but perhaps not the whole of what I am," then the transition may be understood differently. This is one of the deeper purposes behind Vedic teachings on impermanence and non-attachment. They are not asking you to hate life. They are asking you to see life clearly, love the body, care for the home, love the family, do your duty, build meaningful things, but do not mistake temporary possession for permanent identity, because eventually everything borrowed must be returned. This is not pessimism, it is clarity, and clarity changes how you live. You begin loving people more deeply because you know they cannot be physically held forever. You begin wasting less time on meaningless conflict. You become less obsessed with proving yourself. You stop treating every possession as if your existence depends on it, because the first shock after death may be connected to one brutal realization: the world continues without your control. That can be difficult even to imagine while alive. We build routines that make us feel essential. We think, my family needs me, my business needs me, my home needs me, my responsibilities cannot continue without me. Then death arrives and the world continues. The sun rises, people eat, doors open, phones ring, traffic moves, children grow, seasons change. The world does not stop because one individual leaves it. This can sound harsh, but spiritually it can be liberating, because it reminds you that your purpose was never to control everything. Your purpose was to participate consciously while you were here. This is also where love becomes especially important. Love can remain deeply meaningful after death. But love and possession are not the same. You can love someone without being able to stay physically beside them forever. You can care deeply without owning. This is a lesson many people only understand when loss forces them to. Perhaps the soul, in the earliest stage after death, also faces this truth. The family is loved, but the old form of closeness has ended. The home is familiar, but residence has changed. The name mattered, but the name no longer contains the whole journey. This is where the first loosening may begin, slowly, not necessarily all at once. And perhaps that is why certain traditions emphasize calm prayers, respectful remembrance, sacred recitation, silence, and blessing after death. The purpose is not to terrify the family. It is not to create obsession about invisible events. It is to create an atmosphere of dignity and release. Instead of emotionally screaming, "Do not leave us," spiritual remembrance can slowly become, "May your journey continue in peace." That is a profound shift, because grief naturally wants to hold. Love eventually has to learn release. And this is where the living and the dead seem to mirror one another. The family must learn to live without the physical presence. The departed, within this spiritual interpretation, may have to loosen identification with the physical life. Both sides confront the same truth. Med sim wintonen fission dun meist infinitut herstationed. With the physical life, both sides confront the same truth. Something deeply loved has changed form. This is why the first days can feel so intense for the living. The house still contains traces of the person, their clothes, their chair, their voice in memory, their habits. The mind keeps expecting them to appear. The family may wake and forget for 1 second that they are gone. Then reality returns. That same principle gives us a useful way to understand the spiritual metaphor. If the living mind needs time to adjust to loss, perhaps the idea of gradual transition after death is not difficult to understand symbolically. The body stops, but the meaning of a lifetime does not instantly become emotionally simple, and perhaps this is the first golden truth of the soul's 7th night. Death may separate the soul from the body in a moment, but attachment may take longer to loosen. That is why the first question after death may not be, "Where has the soul gone?" Perhaps the more revealing question is, what is the soul still holding? The home, the family, the unfinished promise, the fear, the role, the identity? Because whatever we practice strongly in life may become difficult to release. And that is why this chapter is not really only about the dead. It is about you, right now. What are you holding so tightly that you cannot imagine yourself without it? Your status, your relationship, your money, your body, your reputation, your plans? One day, every one of these things will change. So perhaps the deepest preparation for death is not to become afraid of losing them. It is to learn how to love them without becoming imprisoned by them. Care deeply, but hold gently. Serve fully, but remember impermanence. Love people as if they matter more than your pride, because they do. And when the first shock eventually comes, perhaps the consciousness that practiced awareness during life may be better prepared for the truth death reveals instantly. You were never the things you possessed. You were never only the roles you played. You were never only the name people called you. And perhaps the journey after death begins when that realization starts becoming unavoidable. Chapter 2. Why the home and family may remain powerful in the soul's inner impressions. If there is one thing a human being finds hardest to release, it is not property, it is not money, it is not even the body. It is the people connected to the heart. A person may spend decades building a family, protecting them, worrying about them, eating with them, speaking with them, forgiving them, arguing with them, and loving them in ways that become part of identity itself. A mother may think, "My children need me." A father may think, "I have to protect this family." A husband may think, "This is my home." A wife may think, "These are the people I built my life around." Then death comes and changes the form of that relationship instantly. Within Vedic-inspired traditions, this is one reason the family and the home may remain powerful in the inner impressions connected with the early after-death journey. Not because we can say with certainty that every departed soul is literally standing in the same house, but because attachment does not disappear simply because the body is gone. Attachment is practiced, it is repeated, it becomes deeply woven into consciousness. This is where samskaras matter again. If you spent 40 years waking beside the same person, caring for the same children, worrying about the same household, walking through the same doorway, sitting in the same chair, and hearing the same voices, then those patterns became more than habits. They became emotional imprints. And perhaps this is why the idea of leaving home after death is spiritually powerful. The home is not only a building, it contains memory, identity, comfort, belonging, responsibility, love. A particular room may carry decades of emotional meaning. A family dining area may contain birthdays, arguments, celebrations, silence, grief, laughter. A doorway may be where someone said goodbye every morning. A bed may hold years of shared life. These places become loaded with impression. So within this spiritual framework, it is understandable why the soul may be imagined as remaining strongly oriented toward the familiar in the earliest days. The unknown is ahead, the familiar is behind, and the familiar has been loved for an entire lifetime. Nid. This is also why the grief of the family can feel so intense. The living are not only missing a person, they are suddenly living inside a world full of reminders. The cup remains, the clothes remain, the photograph remains, the favorite chair remains, but the person is gone. This is one of the deepest pains in bereavement. The outer world looks almost the same, but the meaning of everything has changed. And that brings us to something important. The living and the departed, within this symbolic Vedic-inspired view, may both be confronting attachment from opposite sides. The family says, "We do not want you to go." The departed, in spiritual imagination, may still be connected to the life that says, "This is my family. This is my home." Both sides are holding, and love makes holding feel natural. But love and attachment are not exactly the same thing. Love says, "You matter to me." Attachment says, "I cannot accept life if you are not here in the same form." This difference is difficult, because when someone dies, the heart naturally resists. It wants one more conversation, one more meal, one more morning, one more chance to say what was never said. That is human. But spiritual maturity eventually asks something harder. Can you love someone without trying to keep them where they can no longer remain? That question is central to this chapter, because Vedic-inspired traditions often place great importance on release, not forgetting. Release. These are different. Forgetting says, you no longer matter. Release says, you mattered deeply, and because you mattered, I will not let my fear turn love into a chain. That is one of the strongest forms of love. Sometimes the family unknowingly makes grief heavier by repeating inwardly, do not leave, come back, stay with us. The heart means love, but beneath the love is refusal, and refusal can make grief feel endless. This is why remembrance rituals can have deep psychological and spiritual value. They create a structure for grief. They say, we remember you, we honor you, we are grateful, and we recognize that this form of life has ended. That last sentence is the hardest, but it is also where healing begins. Within the spiritual framework of this audiobook, perhaps such remembrance also symbolically helps loosen the emotional field around the departed. Not as a magical guarantee, not as proof of exactly what happens invisibly, but as a meaningful act of love and acceptance. This may also explain why peaceful surroundings are emphasized in many death traditions. Calm words, sacred recitation, prayer, silence, blessings, respectful treatment of the body. These acts create an atmosphere that says, this transition is real. We will not pretend it did not happen. We will not turn grief into panic. We will honor the journey. This matters because panic creates clinging, and clinging creates suffering. The living suffer because they refuse reality. The spiritual story of the soul also becomes one of learning to loosen from the reality that has ended. This does not mean emotion should be suppressed. Grief is not weakness. Crying is not failure. Missing someone is not lack of spiritual understanding. The point is not to become cold. The point is to let grief move. A river moves. A wound slowly changes. A memory softens. But if grief becomes frozen into one sentence, I cannot let you go, then the heart remains trapped at the moment of loss. This is why true remembrance must eventually become blessing. At first you cry, why did you leave? Later, perhaps you can say, thank you for the time we had. Later still, may you be at peace. This is not betrayal. It is evolution of love. And perhaps the same principle applies within the Vedic-inspired image of the soul. At first, the impressions of home and family may feel very strong. The mind of the living may imagine the departed as still connected to what was loved most deeply, but over time, the pull may begin to weaken. The home remains important, the family remains important, but identity begins to change. This is one of the profound truths of death. Relationships do not always disappear, but their form does. The role father may no longer be enacted through a body. The role mother may no longer exist in the same physical sense, but the love expressed through that role has already shaped other people. A father's patience may continue in his child. A mother's kindness may continue in her daughter. A teacher's wisdom may continue in a student. This is how love can remain without requiring physical presence. And this is a much more powerful way to understand continuation. You do not have to insist that someone is physically near in order to say their impact remains. Their samskaras may live in you through memory and influence. Their habits may have shaped yours. Their values may still guide decisions. Their voice may still appear in your mind when you face difficulty. In this sense, relationships continue through impression, and that is deeply Vedic in spirit. Because samskaras are not only private, human beings leave impressions in one another. Every relationship changes both sides. This is why death can feel like losing part of yourself. You were shaped in relationship. Someone was woven into your daily identity. When they die, you are not only losing them, you are also losing the version of yourself that existed with them. A wife may no longer hear herself called by the same name. A child may no longer have a parent to return to. A sibling may lose the only person who remembered childhood in the same way. This is why grief can feel like disorientation. The world has not only lost a person, your own identity has shifted, and this may help you understand why the home becomes such a powerful symbol. The house holds the old identity in place. Everything says, "This is how life used to be." The empty chair says it. The closed room says it. The untouched clothes say it. The silence says it. At first, the family may feel trapped inside these reminders, but eventually, those same reminders can change. The chair becomes memory instead of shock. The room becomes sacred instead of unbearable. The photograph becomes gratitude instead of disbelief. This is grief transforming, and perhaps symbolically, the seventh-day journey reflects a similar movement, from immediate attachment toward gradual release, from "this is still mine" toward "this was part of my journey." That is a major shift. It is also why clinging to the body can be such a powerful metaphor. The body was the primary vehicle of relationship. Hands touched, eyes met, voices spoke. When the body ends, the old relationship cannot continue in the same form. This is painful, but it also reveals something important. Love is deeper than possession of form. If love existed only because a body was visible, it would disappear completely at death. But it does not. That proves something emotionally significant, even if not metaphysically provable. Love can continue as meaning, as influence, as memory, as transformed identity. This is where the living can help themselves. Instead of asking only, "Is the soul still here?" ask, "What did this person leave inside me?" Maybe courage, maybe discipline, maybe tenderness, maybe a warning, maybe a lesson, maybe a way of seeing life. That question is often more useful than trying to interpret every sound, dream, or coincidence after death, because grief can make the mind search constantly. A door moves. You wonder if it is them. You smell a familiar scent. You wonder if it is a message. You dream of them. You wonder if they visited. These experiences can feel deeply meaningful, but they should be held gently. A dream can comfort you without being treated as proof. A memory can feel sacred without needing a supernatural explanation. This balance protects the heart from obsession, and it also honors the mystery. Not everything must be explained. Some things can simply be felt. This is especially important in the first week. The family is emotionally vulnerable. Every sign can feel enormous. Every silence can feel unbearable. So the healthiest spiritual question is not, "How do I prove the soul is still near?" It is, "How do I love without becoming trapped in fear?" That may be the true lesson of the second chapter. The family and the home are powerful because they represent attachment at its deepest. And if the soul's journey involves release, then these bonds become one of the greatest tests of letting go. But letting go does not mean becoming indifferent. It means changing the way love is held. At first, "I need you here." Later, "I wish you were here." Later still, "I am grateful you were here." And eventually, "Your life changed mine." That is a mature form of remembrance. Perhaps the departed, in this spiritual framework, also moves through a similar shift, from "my family" toward "the family I loved," from "my home" toward "the home where I lived." The difference is subtle, but spiritually it is enormous. The word "my" begins to loosen, and that may be one of the first great movements after death, not loss of love, loss of possession. This is why non-attachment is so misunderstood. People think it means loving less, but real non-attachment allows love to become cleaner. You can love without controlling, care without possessing, remember without refusing change. This is love without chains. And perhaps that is exactly what both the living and the departed need. The living need permission to continue. The departed, within this symbolic interpretation, need permission to move forward. This is why one of the most beautiful things a grieving person can eventually say is, "I love you enough not to make my fear your prison." That sentence contains enormous spiritual maturity, and perhaps this is the second golden truth of the soul's seventh night. The home may remain familiar, the family may remain deeply loved, but the soul's journey may require love to survive without possession. That is the difficult transition. The relationship is not erased. It is transformed. The house remains behind. The family continues living. The old roles begin to dissolve, and something that once said, "I cannot leave this," may gradually become, "I can love this without remaining bound to it." And when that shift begins, the soul's journey may be ready to move deeper into the mystery of what comes next. Chapter 3. The Weight of Unfinished Desires, What the Soul May Still Carry. There is something deeply unsettling about an unfinished life, a sentence never spoken, an apology never given, a promise never fulfilled, a dream interrupted halfway, a person loved but never properly thanked, a resentment carried for years, a fear that was never faced. When death comes suddenly, the body may stop, but the emotional momentum of a lifetime does not become meaningless in one instant. Within Vedic-inspired thought, this is where desire, attachment, and samskaras become especially important. A person does not only live through actions, they also live through tendencies, through repeated thoughts, through what they chase, what they fear, what they refuse to release, what they keep telling themselves they cannot live without. And when life ends, those inner patterns are what make the idea of transition so powerful. Imagine someone who spent years thinking, "I will tell them tomorrow, I will forgive later, I will rest when this work is finished, I will repair that relationship one day, I will start living after I achieve this." Then one day, there is no tomorrow. This is why teachings about death are not only about what happens after death. They are warnings about delay, because unfinished desire creates weight. Not necessarily a supernatural weight that we can measure, but a psychological and spiritual weight. A person who spends a lifetime clinging does not suddenly become someone who knows how to release. A person who spends decades living in resentment has practiced resentment more than forgiveness. A person who has built identity entirely around possession, status, or control has strengthened those impressions again and again. This is where samskaras matter. Every repeated emotion leaves a groove. Every repeated action deepens it. Every repeated attachment says, "This matters. Hold this. Become this." And eventually, the pattern becomes automatic. That is why some Vedic-inspired traditions emphasize the importance of what occupies the mind during life, because the mind you carry toward death is the mind you trained while living. This does not mean one final thought mechanically decides everything. It means the inner life has momentum, and momentum matters. Think of a wheel that has been spinning for years. You can stop pushing it, but it does not become still immediately. In the same way, a lifetime of desire may not become spiritually irrelevant the moment the heart stops beating, the body stops. The pattern may still have force. This is why unfinished desires can be so powerful in the imagination of the after-death journey. Maybe someone desperately wanted to protect a child. Maybe someone died angry at a brother. Maybe someone spent years attached to a home. Maybe someone feared losing money more than anything. Maybe someone had one deep dream they believed defined their entire existence. If those tendencies shape the person strongly enough, then within a spiritual framework, it makes sense to imagine that they do not simply vanish without transition. But there is something even more important. Unfinished desire is not always about big ambitions. Sometimes the strongest attachment is very small. One room, one object, one person, one regret, one sentence. The mind can carry enormous emotional weight around something tiny. This is why spiritual practice repeatedly asks, what are you feeding? What are you rehearsing? What are you making stronger inside yourself? Because whatever you repeatedly strengthen becomes easier to repeat, and whatever you repeatedly repeat begins to feel like identity. This is where the living should pay attention. Death exposes the danger of postponement. How many people are carrying conversations they should have had years ago? How many are waiting for the perfect moment to forgive? How many are sacrificing peace for pride? How many are building a life they secretly do not even want because they think there will always be time to change it later? This is exactly why the subject of unfinished desire becomes so powerful. It asks you to imagine what would remain emotionally unresolved if your life ended tonight. Not to frighten you, to clarify you. If there is someone you need to thank, why wait? If there is someone you need to forgive, why turn another year into a prison? If there is something false in your life, why keep feeding it? If you are living only for approval, what will that approval mean when the people giving it are no longer around? Death destroys many illusions. One of the biggest is the illusion that there is always more time. This is why the spiritual preparation for death begins long before death. It begins when you stop postponing the inner work. You release resentment now. You simplify now. You tell the truth now. You repair what can still be repaired now. You stop feeding desires that control you now, because every act of release becomes training. This is one of the deepest Vedic-inspired lessons. Non-attachment is not a final skill you suddenly discover at the end. It is practiced in small moments. You practice when someone disagrees with you, and you do not need to win. You practice when you lose something and do not let the loss destroy your identity. You practice when someone leaves and you allow grief without turning it into self-destruction. You practice when you stop chasing what you know is harming you. You practice when you recognize that not every desire deserves obedience. This is how the inner grip weakens, and this matters because desire itself is not always the enemy. Desire can move you toward learning, toward love, toward service, toward growth. The issue is not having desire. The issue is becoming possessed by desire. There is a difference between "I would like this" and "I cannot be whole without this." One is preference, the other is bondage. The same is true with relationships. You can love someone deeply, but if your entire identity collapses without them, love has become fused with dependency. You can value your home, but if you believe your worth is contained in the property, the home has become part of your ego. You can work toward success, but if failure makes you believe you are nothing, ambition has become identity. This is why death becomes such a ruthless teacher. It asks, what happens when the thing you built yourself around can no longer be carried? What remains then? That is the real question. And maybe this is why unfinished desires are so spiritually significant. They expose what we were attached to so strongly that we could not imagine ourselves without it. This is also why some people die with a sense of peace, and others seem to leave life with enormous inner conflict. We cannot know the invisible state of any individual soul, but as a principle, a life of acceptance may prepare a different inner landscape than a life of constant grasping. A person who has repeatedly practiced, "This too will change, this too will pass. I can love without owning. I can work without worshipping the result. I can forgive. I can release," has been preparing for impermanence for years. That does not mean death becomes easy. It means the person has rehearsed one of its deepest lessons. This is where chapter 3 becomes much more personal. Ask yourself, if you died with one desire unfinished, which one would disturb you most? Would it be money, reputation, a person, an apology, a dream, a secret, a relationship you never healed? The answer tells you something. It tells you where emotional weight has accumulated. And perhaps that is exactly what spiritual awareness is for, to show you the places where you are not free, not to shame you, to wake you up. Because the goal is not to eliminate every wish. It is to stop turning temporary wishes into permanent prisons. There is also another side to unfinished desires. Sometimes people feel guilty after someone dies because they believe they should have done more. I should have called. I should have visited. I should have listened. I should have forgiven. This guilt can become another form of attachment. The living begin carrying an unfinished story on behalf of the dead, and then grief becomes mixed with self-punishment. This is where compassion is needed. You cannot rewrite what has ended. You can only transform what remains. If you regret not showing more love, show more love now to those still here. If you regret holding resentment, become someone who forgives sooner. If you regret wasting time, stop wasting the time you still have. This is how regret becomes practice instead of poison. And perhaps this is one of the most meaningful ways to honor the dead, not by endlessly punishing yourself for what you failed to do, but by refusing to repeat the same unconsciousness. That is transformation. This is also where the idea of karma becomes useful in a grounded way. Karma is not merely punishment. It is cause and effect. Action creates consequence. Repeated action creates tendency. Tendency shapes future action. If a person spends years reacting in anger, anger becomes easier. If a person spends years practicing patience, patience becomes more available. If a person spends years chasing approval, the need for approval strengthens. If a person spends years practicing inner independence, the grip of outside validation weakens. This is why samskara and karma are closely related. The impression creates tendency. The tendency influences action. The action creates more impression. A loop forms, and death may interrupt the outer stage of that loop. But within traditions that accept continuity of consciousness, the deeper question becomes whether the inner momentum has fully ended. Again, we cannot prove the invisible details, but as a spiritual metaphor, the lesson is powerful. Do not wait until the final moment to become free of patterns you have spent decades strengthening. Start now. If you are controlled by anger, work with it now. If you are addicted to being needed, notice it now. If you are unable to let go of betrayal, begin loosening now. If you keep postponing joy until some future achievement, question that now. Because perhaps the real danger is not death, perhaps the real danger is reaching death after never having truly lived consciously. That is a much more confronting thought. A person can live for 70 years and still spend most of that time reacting automatically, chasing, comparing, defending, proving, resenting, repeating. Then suddenly the body ends. What was all that effort for? This is why the Vedic-inspired path repeatedly returns to awareness. Awareness interrupts momentum. Without awareness, desire becomes automatic. With awareness, there is a pause. The mind says, I want this. Awareness asks, why? The ego says, I must have this. Awareness asks, what happens if I do not? Fear says, I cannot lose this. Awareness asks, was it ever truly mine? That pause is freedom beginning, and every time you practice that pause, you weaken the grip of unconscious desire. This is how one prepares for release, not by rejecting life, by participating without being consumed by it. Enjoy beauty, but no beauty changes. Love deeply, but no forms change. Work seriously, but no results are temporary. Care for the body, but know the body is not permanent. Build a home, but know one day you will leave it. This is not coldness, it is mature love. You begin to appreciate more because you stop pretending permanence. And this changes relationships too. When you know someone is not guaranteed tomorrow, you become less interested in winning meaningless arguments. You become quicker to say, I love you, I am sorry, thank you, I forgive you. These sentences can release years of emotional weight, and perhaps this is one of the greatest tragedies of death. People often become ready to say the important things after the person can no longer hear them in the ordinary way. Do not wait for that moment. Say what matters now. This is also why unfinished desire should not only be understood as personal craving. There are also unfinished duties, dharma, responsibilities, things you knew were right but kept postponing. A parent avoiding responsibility, a person refusing to repair harm, someone living against their deepest values. These create another kind of inner tension, because the psyche often knows when it is avoiding something important. That tension becomes part of the samskara. Again, death teaches urgency, not panic. Urgency. There is a difference. Panic says, "I am running out of time." Urgency says, "Because time is limited, I should stop wasting it." That is a much healthier response. This is why meditating on death has historically been used to sharpen life, not to make people depressed, to make them awake. If you remember that life is temporary, small things return to their proper size. The insult becomes smaller, the status competition becomes smaller, the pointless argument becomes smaller. What grows? Love, presence, integrity, service, meaning. This is the gift hidden inside mortality. And perhaps this is why Chapter 3 sits before the symbolic seventh-day turning point. Before one can move forward, there must be some loosening from what was unfinished, not necessarily because every desire is completed. Sometimes completion is impossible, but perhaps the grip can still change. A person may never get the apology, never reach the dream, never finish the plan. But perhaps consciousness can still move from "this must happen" to "this did not happen, and I release the demand." That is freedom. This is one of the deepest forms of non-attachment. You do not need life to obey your expectations before you can find peace. That lesson is difficult while alive. It may be even more important when life itself ends. And perhaps this is the third golden truth of the soul's seventh night. The soul may not carry unfinished events as much as it carries the attachment that formed around them. The event is over, the conversation ended, the house is behind, the plan is incomplete. But the inner grip is the real weight, and the journey toward release may begin when that grip starts to soften. So ask yourself now, what are you still demanding from life before you allow yourself peace? What are you refusing to forgive? What are you postponing because you assume tomorrow belongs to you? What desire has become so powerful that you no longer know who you are without it? These questions are not about death alone. They are about freedom. Because perhaps the greatest preparation for the soul's final release is to practice one simple truth while you still have breath. Not everything unfinished needs to remain unresolved inside you. Some things can be released. Some things can be forgiven. Some things can be accepted. Some things can be left incomplete without leaving you incomplete. And when you understand that, you begin approaching the deeper mystery of what the seventh day may represent. Not completion of every unfinished story, but perhaps the beginning of freedom from the need to keep holding them. Chapter 4. Why the seventh day may represent a turning point. By the time the symbolic seventh day arrives, something important has already changed. The death is no longer only a sudden event. The family has spent several days waking into a reality they did not choose. The body is no longer part of ordinary life. The house has already begun to feel different. The familiar routines have been interrupted. The first waves of shock have started changing into grief, and grief has started changing into a deeper recognition that this loss is real. Within a Vedic-inspired spiritual framework, the seventh day can therefore be understood as a powerful threshold, not because every soul is guaranteed to experience one identical event at one exact hour, but because 7 days can symbolize the closing of an initial cycle and the beginning of a different relationship with what has ended. This distinction matters because spiritual teachings become weaker when they pretend to know more than they can truly know. There is no single universally accepted Vedic doctrine that says every departed soul follows the same mechanical timetable, moving from one invisible location to another exactly according to the clock. Different traditions, regions, ritual systems, philosophical schools, and family customs have described the after-death journey in different ways. Some focus more heavily on ritual, some on karma, some on the subtle body, some on rebirth, some on liberation, and some on the responsibilities of the living. So when we speak of the seventh day as a turning point, it is wiser to understand it as a spiritual threshold rather than as a supernatural appointment written into the universe. And yet the symbol is powerful. 7 days form one complete weekly cycle. The first morning after death becomes the seventh morning. The first night becomes the seventh night. The family has lived through an entire sequence of waking, eating, sleeping, remembering, crying, speaking, and sitting in silence without the person who used to be there. Even psychologically, this matters. The mind begins to understand what the heart still resists. What felt impossible on the first day begins to become undeniable by the seventh. The person is not walking back through the door. The chair remains empty. The phone will not ring with their voice. The future is beginning to rearrange itself around an absence. Within the spiritual imagination of this audiobook, perhaps something similar may be understood in relation to the soul. The first days may be symbolically associated with strong orientation toward the familiar, the body, the home, the family, the identity, the routines, the unfinished desires, the emotional weight of a life that has just ended. But as the initial cycle completes, perhaps the direction begins to change. The pull backward may still exist, but the movement forward may begin becoming stronger. The question may no longer be only, "What have I left?" It may begin changing into, "What now remains when the life I knew can no longer continue?" This is a profound question, because most of human identity is built through repetition. We wake in the same body, we hear the same name, we respond to the same relationships. We occupy the same roles. We say, "I am a father, I am a mother, I am a husband, I am a wife, I am a teacher, I am successful, I am poor, I am admired, I am rejected, I am healthy, I am ill." And slowly these descriptions begin to feel like the deepest truth of who we are. Then death arrives and removes the stage upon which these identities were performed. The role does not continue in the same physical form. The body cannot continue the habit. The name remains in the mouths of others, but the person can no longer respond to it through the body that carried it. Perhaps this is why the seventh day may symbolize the beginning of a deeper separation from identity itself. Not only separation from flesh, but separation from the story that flesh carried. That is far more difficult. The body may end in a moment, but the sense of me has been rehearsed for decades. The house was my house. The family was my family. The work was my work. The possessions were my possessions. The dreams were my future. The memories were my past. Almost every thought was wrapped around the word my. Then suddenly, the journey demands a confrontation with a terrifying and liberating possibility. What remains when mine begins to disappear? This is where non-attachment becomes more than a philosophical idea. While we are alive, non-attachment can sound abstract. People hear it and think it means not caring, not loving, or not participating in life. But that is not the point. Non-attachment means loving without pretending ownership is permanent. It means caring deeply while understanding that every form changes. It means giving yourself fully to life without insisting that life must remain exactly as you prefer. Death exposes why this teaching exists. It is not meant to make life cold. It is meant to prepare consciousness for the truth that every form, every relationship, every possession, and every identity will eventually change. By the symbolic seventh day, perhaps that truth becomes harder to resist. The old life may still be emotionally powerful, but the possibility of returning to it in the same form has weakened. The body is no longer available. The routines are no longer possible. The family may still be grieving, but the household has already begun adjusting in small ways. Somebody else answers the door. Somebody else handles the responsibility. Somebody else moves the chair. Somebody else makes the decision the departed once made. Life, painfully and quietly, begins continuing. For the living, this can feel almost like betrayal at first. How can the world keep moving? How can people laugh again? How can meals still be cooked? How can the sun rise when someone so important is gone? But this continuation is not disrespect. It is part of reality. The living must eventually re-enter life because grief is not meant to freeze time forever. Remembering and continuing can exist together. Love and movement can exist together. Missing someone and still living can exist together. This is one of the hardest lessons of bereavement. And perhaps, symbolically, the same pattern can be applied to the soul's journey. Love may remain, but movement may still be necessary. Memory may remain meaningful, but identity may still need to loosen. The past may remain sacred, but the journey may still turn towards something beyond it. This is why the seventh day can be imagined as a threshold between holding and releasing, between looking backward and beginning to face forward. There is something else important here. The seventh day may also symbolize a shift in the quality of attachment. During the first days, attachment may feel urgent. The family wants the person back immediately. The mind searches for any sign that the separation is not complete. Dreams feel important. Sounds feel important. Memories feel almost physical. The emotional field around the death is intense. But after several days, a different kind of grief begins appearing. The mind starts understanding that the relationship must now exist in another form. There will be no ordinary conversation, no ordinary touch, no ordinary return. This is where love is tested in a deeper way. Can love survive when possession becomes impossible? Can love remain without the demand for physical presence? Can the family say, "You mattered to us," without saying, "Therefore you must remain exactly as you were"? This is not easy. The heart naturally wants the old form back. But maturity begins when love stops demanding that reality reverse itself. Within a Vedic-inspired view, perhaps the soul also has to encounter a similar truth. The home may remain emotionally significant, but it can no longer function as the same home. The family may remain beloved, but the old role cannot continue physically. The unfinished plans may remain part of the impression, but the old future has ended. The life that was supposed to happen no longer exists in the same form. At some point, holding on becomes impossible. This is why the seventh day can symbolize not abandonment, but acceptance. Acceptance is often misunderstood as saying that what happened was good. That is not what acceptance means. Acceptance means recognizing what is true enough to stop fighting reality. A family does not have to like death in order to accept that it occurred. A grieving person does not have to stop loving in order to accept that the physical relationship has changed. And within the spiritual metaphor, the soul does not have to reject the life it lived in order to begin moving beyond its form. That difference is essential. Release does not erase meaning. Letting go does not make the old life worthless. Moving forward does not prove that the family was unimportant. In fact, the opposite may be true. The life mattered enough to leave impressions. The relationships mattered enough to shape consciousness. The love mattered enough to become part of the journey. But importance does not always require permanence. This is one of the deepest truths hidden inside impermanence. People often think that if something ends, then it was somehow less real. But endings do not erase reality. A flower does not become meaningless because it fades. A childhood does not become unreal because adulthood arrives. A relationship does not become worthless because one person dies. The beauty may have existed precisely because it was temporary. The limitation of time can make presence more precious. Perhaps the seventh day asks the soul, symbolically, to begin understanding this. The lifetime can be honored without being clung to. The family can be loved without being possessed. The body can be remembered without being mistaken for the whole of identity. The past can remain meaningful without becoming a prison. This is also where karma becomes relevant. If the outer identity begins loosening, then what remains more significant within a Vedic-inspired framework is not the social label, but the pattern of consciousness shaped through action. The title may end, but the tendencies created through behavior remain spiritually important. A person may have been called powerful, but if they lived through cruelty, the title cannot protect them from the consequences of their actions. Another person may have had little status, but if they practiced compassion, patience, truthfulness, and service, those qualities shaped the inner life in a different way. This is why death equalizes many things. The wealthy body and the poor body both become temporary. The famous name and the unknown name both eventually fade from ordinary memory. The large house and the small house both remain behind. What then becomes meaningful? In the moral imagination of Vedic philosophy, the answer moves toward karma, samskara, awareness, attachment, and dharma. Not what you possessed, but what you practiced. Not what people called you, but what you became through repeated choices. The seventh day, then, can be understood as the beginning of a different accounting. Not necessarily a literal cosmic courtroom, but a shift in emphasis. The outward life has ended. The inward consequences of how that life was lived become more important. The person can no longer change yesterday. The argument cannot be unsaid. The kindness cannot be taken back. The betrayal cannot be undone. The service cannot be erased. The impressions already formed now carry their own weight. This should deeply affect how the living hear this chapter. Because if the seventh day symbolizes a moment when the outer identity loses some of its force, then you should ask what would remain of you if the labels disappeared today. If nobody knew your job, would your character still be admirable? If your money disappeared, would you still know how to treat people with dignity? If your beauty faded, would you still know who you were? If your status ended, would you still have peace? If the opinions of others vanished, would your life still feel meaningful? These questions can be uncomfortable because modern life trains people to build identity from external things. We measure ourselves through attention, success, possessions, comparison, achievement, and recognition. We spend enormous energy maintaining images that death can dissolve in one moment. The seventh day symbolism exposes how fragile these identities are. And yet this is not meant to make achievement meaningless. You can build, create, work, earn, serve, and succeed. The problem begins when the temporary role becomes the entire self. You are not being asked to abandon life. You are being asked to live with enough awareness that you do not become terrified when life changes form. This is where spiritual practice becomes practical. Every time you sit quietly and observe your thoughts, instead of obeying them, you are practicing separation from identity. Every time you say, "I am feeling anger," instead of, "I am anger," you create distance. Every time you experience loss and refuse to let it define your entire existence, you create resilience. Every time you hold success with gratitude instead of arrogance, you practice non-attachment. These practices may seem small while alive, but symbolically they prepare consciousness for larger releases. If you can let go of a small insult, perhaps you strengthen the capacity to release something larger. If you can forgive an old resentment, perhaps you loosen one chain. If you can accept a change you did not choose, perhaps you become less dependent on control. These are not trivial spiritual exercises, they are rehearsals for impermanence. Perhaps this is why the seventh day matters so much as an image. It reminds us that time moves whether we are ready or not. The first day becomes the second becomes the third. Eventually, 7 days have passed. Grief may not be finished, but time has already carried everyone forward. The soul, within this symbolic understanding, may also be carried toward a deeper stage of release, regardless of whether every attachment has been emotionally resolved. And here another difficult truth appears. Not everything gets closure. Some people die without answers. Some families never get the final conversation. Some relationships end with confusion. Some deaths happen too quickly for preparation. Some plans collapse without explanation. If peace required every story to be completed perfectly, then peace would be impossible for many people. This is why acceptance becomes more important than closure. Closure is often imagined as complete understanding, but life rarely offers that. Acceptance is more humble. It says, I do not understand everything, but I recognize that this has happened. That recognition creates movement. Perhaps the seventh night symbolizes exactly this movement. The soul may not have every answer. The family certainly does not, but both sides of the symbolic journey are being pulled into the same lesson. Life changes form, and refusing that truth cannot restore what has ended. This is also why rituals matter. Ritual is not merely tradition performed because ancestors did it. At its best, ritual gives the human mind a structure for transition. It marks time. It says, something happened. We are acknowledging it. We are honoring it. We are moving through it. A seventh-day remembrance, where present in a family or cultural tradition, may therefore help the living give shape to something emotionally shapeless. Without ritual, grief can feel endless because there is no marker. Ritual creates a threshold. Before this moment, one stage. After this moment, another. It does not end grief, but it gives grief movement. That is psychologically powerful and spiritually meaningful. The same symbolism can be applied inwardly. Perhaps the soul's seventh day is not about location. Perhaps it is about orientation. The attention that was turned backward begins slowly turning toward what lies beyond the known life. The question, why did this end, may begin changing into, what now? The identity, I was this person, may begin loosening into a more mysterious awareness that no longer depends entirely on the biography. This is where fear naturally appears. The unknown can feel more frightening than the known, even when the known has ended. Human beings often prefer familiar suffering over unfamiliar freedom because familiarity feels safe. The same principle makes the idea of transition after death emotionally understandable. If consciousness continues in any form, then moving beyond everything familiar would represent the deepest unknown imaginable, and perhaps this is where trust becomes important. The Vedic tradition, in many of its forms, does not present existence as meaningless chaos. It speaks of karma, dharma, cycles, liberation, rebirth, and deeper law. While interpretations differ, the recurring idea is that life participates in something larger than one individual biography. That can be comforting without becoming certainty. You do not have to pretend you know every detail of what happens after death. You can still live with reverence for the possibility that existence is larger than what the physical senses currently reveal. The seventh day may then symbolize the moment when trust becomes necessary because control is no longer available. The old life cannot be restored through willpower. The family cannot command death to reverse itself. The soul, within the spiritual story, cannot keep every attachment forever. There must be movement. This is why control is another attachment the seventh day exposes. People spend much of life trying to control outcomes, people, timing, reputation, money, relationships, and even how others remember them. Death destroys the illusion of total control more completely than almost anything else. And perhaps this is one reason death contemplation has always had spiritual value. It asks you to practice humility before humility is forced upon you. It reminds you that you are participating in life, not owning it. You can influence much, but you cannot command everything. When this truth is accepted, life becomes strangely lighter. You stop wasting as much energy trying to make everything permanent. You begin investing more energy in what is meaningful while it is present. You love more honestly because you know time is uncertain. You apologize faster because pride starts looking smaller. You appreciate ordinary mornings because they are not guaranteed. You stop treating the people beside you as though you will always have another chance. This is the hidden power of the seventh-day symbol. It looks like a teaching about death, but it is actually a teaching about urgency, not panic, not fear, urgency to live awake. If the soul may eventually have to release the house, then live in your home with gratitude rather than obsession. If the soul may eventually release the body, care for it without worshipping it. If the soul may eventually release relationships in their physical form, love people without wasting years in unnecessary pride. If the soul may eventually release status, stop building your entire worth upon the opinions of others. The seventh day asks, what would become lighter in your life if you stopped pretending it would last forever? Maybe you would forgive sooner. Maybe you would complain less. Maybe you would stop chasing someone who does not respect you. Maybe you would spend more time with the people who matter. Maybe you would begin the work you keep postponing. Maybe you would stop living only for approval. This is why the spiritual imagination of death can be so transformative. It rearranges value. Imagine standing at the seventh night of your own life's ending and looking backward. Which things would suddenly seem foolish? Which arguments would appear tiny? Which fears would lose their power? Which people would you wish you had appreciated more? Which moments would you wish you had actually been present for instead of mentally somewhere else? These questions are not meant to create sadness. They are meant to rescue you from unconscious living. Within this Vedic-inspired journey, the seventh day may symbolize the soul beginning to face forward, but for the living, it should symbolize a decision to live differently before that day arrives. Do not wait until everything becomes memory before you recognize its value. Do not wait until someone becomes a photograph before you speak kindly. Do not wait until a home becomes empty before you appreciate the ordinary sounds inside it. Do not wait until your health changes before you respect the body. Do not wait until time is gone before you ask what your time was for. This is the fourth golden truth of the soul's seventh night. The seventh day may not be powerful because a mysterious cosmic clock suddenly changes everything. It may be powerful because it represents the moment when holding the old form becomes harder than accepting that the journey has changed. The body is behind, the old role is behind, the house is behind. The first shock is beginning to soften. The unfinished desires may still leave impressions. The family may still be deeply loved, but the direction begins changing. The soul, within this symbolic understanding, may begin facing what comes next, and perhaps that is what makes the seventh night so powerful. It stands at the border between memory and movement, between attachment and acceptance, between the identity that ended and the mystery that remains. The question is no longer only, what did I lose? It becomes something deeper. What can I no longer carry? And what was important enough to shape who I became? That question does not belong only to the dead. It belongs to every living person who still has time to choose what kind of impressions they are creating before their own seventh night ever arrives. Chapter 5. When attachment may begin to loosen. By the fifth chapter, the journey has reached a deeper place. The first shock has already been faced. The power of home and family has been explored. The weight of unfinished desires has been brought into the light. The symbolic seventh day has been introduced as a turning point, not as a rigid supernatural timetable, but as a threshold where the relationship with the old life may begin to change. Now comes one of the hardest questions of all. What happens when the soul can no longer keep holding everything the same way? Within a Vedic-inspired understanding, attachment is not simply about loving something. Attachment is what happens when the mind says, "Without this, I cannot be complete." It is the difference between caring and clinging, between gratitude and possession, between love and the demand that love never change form. This distinction is important because many people misunderstand non-attachment as coldness. They imagine that, to release something spiritually, you must stop caring about it. But that is not what release means. You can love deeply and still understand that the form of the relationship may change. You can honor a home and still know that you cannot remain in it forever. You can cherish a body and still know that the body is temporary. You can value a role and still recognize that the role is not the whole of who you are. Perhaps this is what the soul, within the symbolic journey of the soul's seventh night, gradually begins to confront. The old world is still meaningful, but the grip may begin weakening. At first, the pull toward the familiar may be overwhelming. The house, the voices, the unfinished routines, the people who were loved, the identity that seemed permanent only days before. But eventually, reality changes the relationship. The home is still there, but not in the same way. The family is still loved, but the old physical bond has ended. The body is still remembered, but it can no longer function as the center of identity. This is where attachment begins to transform. Not because love disappears, because possession becomes impossible. That is a very important distinction. Love can remain. Clinging cannot remain forever. And this is where Vedic-inspired wisdom becomes powerful. It repeatedly reminds us that everything embodied belongs to change. The body changes every year. Relationships change, homes change, social roles change. Even the personality you call me is not the same at age 10, 30, 50, or 70. Yet while we are alive, we keep pretending permanence. We say, "This is mine, my house, my person, my success, my body, my future." And the word "my" becomes so strong that we forget the temporary nature of possession. Death interrupts that illusion. Suddenly, nothing can be held in the same way. The hands are gone, the routines are gone. The ability to control is gone, the future plans are gone. So what remains? Within the moral and spiritual imagination of Vedic traditions, what remains important is not what was possessed, but what was cultivated, not what you owned, but what you became, not what you collected, but what impressions you created, not how much praise you received, but how you treated people when praise was not involved. This is why attachment begins to look different after death. A house may have been beautiful, but beauty cannot be carried in the same form. Money may have been powerful, but it cannot purchase another breath. Status may have mattered socially, but it cannot prevent impermanence. And perhaps the soul, within this symbolic framework, begins to understand something that the living often refuse to understand. Possession was always temporary. This can sound severe, but it can also be deeply freeing. Because if possession is temporary, then your peace does not have to depend on keeping everything forever. You can appreciate without gripping. You can love without demanding permanence. You can participate without being imprisoned. That is where non-attachment becomes beautiful instead of frightening. Imagine a person who spent their entire life believing their worth came from wealth. They built, earned, accumulated, defended, compared, and constantly feared loss. Then death arrives. The wealth remains behind. Someone else receives it. Someone else spends it. Someone else decides what happens to it. If the person's identity was built entirely around possession, then the separation may feel spiritually profound. Not because money itself is evil, but because identity became dependent on something temporary. The same can happen with relationships. Someone may spend years believing, "I am nothing without this person." Then death, separation, or change occurs. The pain becomes enormous because love was mixed with identity. This is why attachment often creates suffering. Not because relationships are wrong, because we ask temporary forms to provide permanent security. The same pattern applies to the body. We identify so completely with appearance, strength, age, health, and physical identity that when the body changes, we feel that the self is disappearing. But Vedic-inspired thought often invites a deeper question. Are you only what changes? Or is there something about awareness itself that observes the change? This question becomes especially powerful in the context of death. The body has changed completely, but within traditions that accept continuation of consciousness, The spiritual journey asks whether identity can continue without the familiar physical form. Again, this cannot be proven through ordinary observation, but as a spiritual framework, it encourages humility and awareness. Perhaps this is why the loosening of attachment may begin around the symbolic seventh day. The soul, in this interpretation, may no longer be able to sustain the same sense of mine. The house is no longer my house in the same way. The family is no longer my family in the same physical role. The belongings are no longer my belongings. The body is no longer my body. The word my begins to soften, and perhaps that is one of the deepest transformations after death. Not the disappearance of love, the disappearance of ownership. There is a major difference. You can love a child without owning the child. You can love a partner without believing they exist to complete you. You can love your home without believing your soul depends on its walls. You can love your life without pretending it will never end. This is mature love. It is not weaker, it is cleaner. It is less fearful, it has fewer chains. And perhaps that is why spiritual traditions encourage people to practice letting go while still alive. Because attachment is easier to work with gradually than all at once. Every day gives you opportunities. Someone disagrees with you. Can you let go of the need to win? Someone fails to appreciate you. Can you let go of the need for approval? Something breaks. Can you accept the loss without allowing it to destroy your peace? A relationship changes. Can you grieve without turning grief into self-destruction? A plan fails. Can you adapt without believing your life has ended? These small moments are training. They seem ordinary, but spiritually, they are enormous. Each one teaches the mind. I can survive change. I can release. I can continue. I am more than this one thing. And perhaps these small releases prepare consciousness for the larger release that death represents. This is why a spiritually aware life is not about avoiding attachment through isolation. It is about learning how to engage without becoming possessed. You can participate fully. You can marry, build a family, create a home, earn money, serve people, build something meaningful. But the inner attitude changes. You stop saying, "This is mine forever." You begin saying, "This is part of my journey for as long as it is here." That one shift can change everything. Gratitude replaces entitlement. Presence replaces control. Love replaces fear. This is also where the family's role becomes important. The living often think that holding tightly is proof of love, but sometimes love eventually requires release. A grieving person may say inwardly, "I cannot let you go." That sentence is understandable, but over time, perhaps it can become, "I will carry your love, but I will not force myself to remain frozen in your absence." That is healing, and within the spiritual symbolism of this audiobook, perhaps the same kind of release is imagined for the departed. The relationship is not rejected, it is transformed. The family remains meaningful, but the old way of belonging has ended. This is why peaceful remembrance can be so powerful. The family can say, "We remember you, we honor you, we are grateful, may your journey continue." This does not erase love. It gives love movement, and movement matters. Grief that never moves becomes suffering. Attachment that never loosens becomes bondage. Memory that never transforms can become a prison. This is why the 5th chapter is about loosening, not forgetting. Forgetting is not the goal. Forgetting would imply that the person, the home, the relationship, and the life no longer mattered. But they did matter. They shaped the person. They created samskaras. They influenced choices. They left impressions in the family. They contributed to identity. Nothing meaningful needs to be denied. The question is simply whether the relationship with those memories can change. This is where the image of an open hand becomes useful. A closed fist grips. An open hand holds differently. It can still carry something, but it is not terrified of movement. Perhaps spiritual non-attachment is like that. The heart remains open, the memory remains, the love remains, but the grip softens. This is especially important when we think about unfinished desires. Chapter 3 explored how regret, ambition, anger, and unfulfilled plans may create emotional weight. But by this stage of the symbolic journey, perhaps some of that weight begins losing force, not because every desire gets fulfilled, because the demand for fulfillment may begin to weaken. That is freedom. A person may have wanted one more conversation, but the conversation cannot happen in the old way. A person may have wanted one more year, but the year is gone. A person may have wanted one more chance to correct something, but the opportunity ended. At some point, peace requires a different sentence. This remained unfinished, but I do not have to remain bound to it. That is one of the deepest forms of release. The event may remain incomplete, but the attachment to completion can change. This is useful even for the living. How many people are suffering not because something happened, but because they demand that it should have happened differently? They keep replaying the past. If only, if only, if only. Years pass, the event is finished, but the attachment to an alternative version remains active. This is where non-attachment becomes healing. You do not have to approve of what happened. You do not have to call pain beautiful. You only stop demanding that the past become something it cannot become. That is acceptance. And perhaps this is what makes the seventh day's symbolism meaningful. The soul may begin moving away from the demand that the old life continue. The family may begin moving away from the demand that the person return. Both are being taught the same lesson. Reality has changed. Love can remain. But the form must transform. This is one of the most difficult truths human beings ever face. We want love without change. We want relationships without endings. We want health without decline. We want youth without age. We want success without loss. We want life without death. But the world does not offer permanence in form. That is precisely why Vedic thought places such emphasis on impermanence and deeper awareness. If forms change, then peace must be rooted somewhere deeper than form. If possessions change, then identity must be deeper than possession. If relationships change, then love must become deeper than control. This is not easy, but it is powerful. And perhaps this is why some people become spiritually transformed after grief. Loss removes illusions that ordinary life allowed them to keep. They suddenly realize how fragile everything is. They stop wasting as much time. They become less interested in arguments, less interested in proving themselves, more interested in being present, more interested in saying what matters. Grief becomes a teacher, not because grief is pleasant, but because it exposes what truly matters. This is why death can create clarity. You look at an empty room and suddenly realize that pride was never as important as you thought. You look at a photograph and suddenly wish you had spent more time listening. You look at the objects someone left behind and realize how little possessions can do once life is gone. These realizations hurt, but they can also awaken. And perhaps the soul, within the Vedic-inspired imagination, goes through its own form of awakening. The things that once seemed essential begin losing their grip. The old identity begins becoming lighter. The story becomes less solid. The name becomes less central. The roles begin falling away. What remains may be more subtle: tendencies, impressions, karma, awareness, the deeper orientation of consciousness. This is why the chapter title is not "When Love Ends." It is "When Attachment May Begin to Loosen." Love is not the problem. Attachment is what turns love into fear. Attachment says, "If I lose this, I lose myself." Non-attachment says, "This matters deeply, but I am not only this." That is the shift. And it may be one of the most important spiritual shifts anyone can practice. Imagine how different life becomes when you stop treating every temporary thing as though your entire identity depends on it. You can enjoy success without arrogance. You can experience failure without collapse. You can love without controlling. You can grieve without believing your life is over. You can change without feeling destroyed. You can grow older without believing you have lost all worth. This is freedom. Not freedom from feeling, freedom from being owned by feeling. And perhaps this is what loosening attachment ultimately means. The soul does not become empty, it becomes less burdened. The family does not become forgotten, love becomes less possessive. The home does not become meaningless, it becomes part of a completed chapter. The body does not become worthless, it becomes recognized as a temporary vehicle. And slowly, the direction changes, the grip weakens, the unknown becomes less frightening than the impossibility of returning. This is where the seventh night begins to approach its deepest symbolism. The journey is no longer dominated only by what has been lost. There is now the possibility of movement, and movement requires space. You cannot move forward while holding everything behind you with both hands. This is why release is necessary. Not punishment, not rejection. Release. Perhaps this is the fifth golden truth of the soul's seventh night. The soul may not need to stop loving what it left behind. It may only need to stop believing that love requires possession. That is a profound difference. The family can remain loved. The memories can remain meaningful. The life can remain sacred. But the grip can soften, and when the grip softens, the journey becomes possible. For the living, the lesson is just as important. Do not wait for death to teach you how to hold gently. Love now, but do not control. Build now, but do not worship what you build. Care now, but do not let fear of loss destroy the beauty of what you still have. Because everything you love is temporary in form. That is exactly why it deserves your full presence. And perhaps when you finally understand that, letting go stops looking like betrayal. It begins looking like wisdom. Chapter 6. What the living should understand before the seventh night. There is a moment after someone dies when grief begins searching for answers everywhere. A dream feels different. A familiar scent suddenly appears. A sound in another room makes the heart race. A photograph seems more alive than before. The grieving mind becomes intensely sensitive because love is still present, but the person who received that love is no longer physically available in the same way. This is why the days following death can become emotionally powerful, spiritually meaningful, and also deeply confusing. Within a Vedic-inspired understanding, the period before the seventh night can be treated as a time of remembrance, dignity, reflection, prayer, and gradual release. But there is something the living must understand very clearly. Grief can make certainty feel more attractive than truth. When someone you love has just died, "I do not know" can feel unbearable. You want to know where they are. You want to know whether they can see you. You want to know whether they are peaceful. You want to know whether the dream you had was truly them. You want something that removes the terrible distance between yesterday, when they were physically present, and today, when they are not. This desire is deeply human, but spiritual wisdom must protect the heart from turning every emotion into proof. A dream can be meaningful without proving exactly where a departed soul is. A sudden memory can feel sacred without proving that someone is standing nearby. A sense of presence can be comforting without giving us certainty about invisible realities. The experience matters, but the interpretation should remain humble. This distinction is especially important during the first week, because grief changes perception. The mind has spent years expecting a person to exist in familiar places. If someone sat in the same chair every evening, your attention may still turn toward that chair automatically. If someone called at the same time every day, you may still expect the phone to ring. If you heard their footsteps every morning, a similar sound can suddenly feel charged with meaning. None of this makes the experience foolish. It shows how deeply another person can become woven into the nervous system, memory, routine, and identity of those who loved them. The living should therefore be careful not to turn mourning into constant searching. If every sound must be interpreted, grief becomes exhausting. If every dream must contain a message, sleep becomes a spiritual investigation. If every coincidence must be evidence, the grieving person can become trapped between hope and fear, unable to allow the loss itself to be real. Vedic-inspired spirituality can offer another way. Instead of asking endlessly, "Is the soul still here?" ask, "How can I honor this relationship without becoming imprisoned by uncertainty?" This question is gentler and stronger at the same time. It allows mystery to remain mystery while giving the living something meaningful to do. The first thing the living can offer is calm remembrance. Not forced calmness, not the suppression of tears, but an atmosphere that does not turn grief into panic. The person has died. That truth is painful enough. There is no need to add fear by imagining that every mistake made by the family will somehow damage the soul's journey. Rituals, prayers, remembrance, and sacred practices can be deeply meaningful, but they should support love and reflection rather than become instruments of terror. This is particularly important because grieving people are vulnerable to guilt. They may begin asking whether they cried too much, whether they said the wrong thing, whether they performed something incorrectly, whether they failed to notice some sign, or whether their sadness is somehow preventing the deceased from moving forward. These thoughts can become another form of suffering. A healthier spiritual approach is to understand that love does not need perfection to be real. The relationship was already shaped through years of words, actions, presence, mistakes, forgiveness, and shared life. The living are not suddenly responsible for controlling an invisible journey they cannot verify. What they can control is the quality of their own response. They can choose respect. They can choose remembrance. They can choose compassion. They can choose to release unnecessary conflict around the death. They can choose to honor the best qualities of the person who died. They can choose to carry forward what was worth carrying. This is where the concept of samskaras becomes meaningful, not only for the departed, but for the living. The deceased has left impressions in those who remain. A mother may have taught patience. A father may have taught responsibility. A friend may have taught courage. A grandparent may have passed down rituals, stories, habits, language, or values. These are impressions living inside the family. The person's body is gone, but the consequences of how they lived are not gone. This is one of the most powerful forms of continuation we can speak about without pretending to know the invisible. Human beings continue through influence. Their choices shape other people, and those people carry something forward. So before the seventh night, instead of only asking what may be changing for the soul, the family can ask what should be changing inside them. Perhaps grief is showing them that they postponed too much love. Perhaps the death reveals how many unnecessary arguments they carried. Perhaps it reminds them that family should not be taken for granted. Perhaps it exposes the fragility of a life spent chasing things that cannot remain. This is why death can become a spiritual teacher, even while it remains painful. It rearranges priorities. Things that seemed huge 1 week earlier suddenly become small. The argument over money, the insult, the competition, the need to be right, the desire to impress people. Then someone dies, and the heart begins asking much simpler questions. Did they know I loved them? Did I spend enough time with them? Did I listen? Did I forgive? Did I allow pride to take years that could have been filled with closeness? These questions can hurt, but they can also awaken. The mistake is to turn that awakening into endless self-punishment. Suppose you regret something after a loved one dies. Maybe you did not call enough. Maybe you were impatient. Maybe the last conversation was not how you wanted it to be. You cannot return to that exact moment. But you can decide what the regret becomes. It can become poison, repeating, I am terrible, I failed, I do not deserve peace. Or it can become wisdom. I now understand the cost of postponing love, and I will not repeat this with the people still here. That is transformation. This is where grief becomes dharma. You take pain and allow it to change action. If you regret not listening, listen better now. If you regret withholding affection, become more generous with it. If you regret wasting years in resentment, stop feeding resentment. If you regret being too busy, reconsider what deserves your time. The dead cannot be brought back into physical life through regret, but the living can become more conscious because of what the loss revealed. Perhaps that is one of the greatest offerings you can make. You do not only remember someone, you allow their absence to teach you how to live differently. This is also why helping others in memory of someone can feel meaningful. A compassionate act does not prove anything about the metaphysics of the afterlife, but it transforms grief into goodness. Instead of allowing sorrow to remain closed inside the heart, you let something beneficial emerge from it. Someone dies, and another person is fed. Someone dies, and a family chooses reconciliation. Someone dies, and a child is helped. Someone dies, and the people who loved them become kinder to one another. Now the death has not become good. Loss does not need to be romanticized, but love has been given direction, and direction is important because grief without direction can become circular. You wake, you miss them. You search, you cry, you remember, you ask why. Then the cycle begins again. Ritual can interrupt this circularity by giving grief movement, a meaningful seventh-day observance where it belongs to a family's tradition can say, "We have reached another threshold." It does not mean mourning is over. It does not mean you should suddenly stop crying. It simply marks that time has moved, and now the relationship with grief may also begin to move. This is why rituals often work even when every participant does not understand every philosophical detail behind them. Humans need thresholds. Birthdays mark time, weddings mark transition, funerals mark death, memorial rituals mark stages in mourning. They help the mind understand that something has changed. Before the seventh night, perhaps the most important transition for the family is from desperate holding toward peaceful remembrance. At first the heart says, "Come back." Later it may say, "I wish you could come back." Eventually it may become, "I know you cannot return in the same form, but I am grateful you were part of my life." That third sentence contains enormous healing. Notice that it does not reduce love. It actually gives love a more mature form. The person is no longer being demanded from reality. They are being honored within memory. This is also why the living should be careful about becoming frightened by dreams of the deceased. Some dreams are peaceful, others are confusing. Some can be disturbing, especially when death was sudden or traumatic. A frightening dream does not automatically mean the soul is suffering, trapped, angry, or asking for something. Dreams can arise from grief, memory, fear, guilt, and emotional processing. If a dream brings comfort, receive the comfort. If it brings confusion, reflect gently. If it brings fear, do not rush into catastrophic interpretations. The human mind is processing an enormous emotional event. This balanced approach is essential because fear spreads quickly in grieving families. One person dreams something frightening, another interprets it dramatically, and suddenly everyone believes something terrible is happening invisibly. Then grief becomes panic. Spirituality should reduce unnecessary fear, not multiply it. There is mystery around death. Humility is appropriate, but mystery is not the same thing as danger. This is why the family can focus on what is within reach: peaceful remembrance, prayer or reflection according to their beliefs, compassionate action, reconciliation, and care for one another. Care for one another is especially important. Death can divide families at exactly the moment they most need unity. Arguments over possessions begin. Old resentments return. People disagree about rituals. Someone thinks another person is not grieving enough. Someone else believes another is crying too much. One relative starts discussing inheritance before the funeral atmosphere has even settled. This is where death can expose character. The person who died cannot take the possessions, yet the living may destroy relationships fighting over what was left behind. There is a painful irony in this. The very event that demonstrates the temporary nature of possessions can cause people to cling to possessions more fiercely. If there is one lesson the seventh night should teach the living, it is this: do not dishonor mortality by turning what the deceased could not carry into a reason to hate one another. A house is not worth losing a sibling. Money is not worth turning grief into bitterness. Objects are not worth carrying resentment for the rest of your own life. Everything being fought over will eventually be left behind again. This perspective can radically change a family. Imagine standing 7 days after someone's death and arguing over something they owned. Then imagine your own death. Another generation will someday argue over the same object, or throw it away, or forget where it came from. That is impermanence. Suddenly the object looks smaller. This is why the seventh day can teach humility to those who remain. The departed may be symbolically imagined as loosening attachment, but the living are being asked the same question. Can you loosen yours? Can you release the need to control how everyone else grieves? Can you release old resentment long enough to sit together? Can you release ownership enough to remember that relationships matter more than objects? Can you release guilt enough to learn rather than punish yourself? Can you release fear enough to allow mystery without inventing certainty? This is what makes Chapter 6 essential. The soul's journey should not become entertainment for the living. The question, what happens after death, matters. But if that question does not change how you treat the living, then you may have missed its deepest lesson. A person can watch hundreds of spiritual teachings about the afterlife and still refuse to forgive their brother. They can study karma and remain cruel. They can talk about the soul while mistreating the people beside them. They can memorize teachings on impermanence while obsessing over possessions. What value has the knowledge produced then? Vedic-inspired wisdom should turn inward. Knowledge becomes valuable when it changes conduct. If death is real, then be kinder. If time is temporary, stop wasting it. If relationships change, appreciate them. If possessions remain behind, hold them lightly. If consciousness is shaped through action, make your actions worthy. This may be the greatest thing the living can understand before the seventh night. Do not use the mystery of death to escape the responsibility of life. People sometimes become so fascinated with what may be happening to the deceased that they neglect those still grieving beside them. A widow may need someone to listen. A child may need reassurance. An elderly parent may need practical help. Someone may be too overwhelmed to eat properly. Someone may be sleeping badly. Someone may not know how to handle responsibilities the deceased used to manage. These needs are not less spiritual than ritual. Compassion is spiritual. Presence is spiritual. Helping someone carry the weight of grief is spiritual. Perhaps the best remembrance sometimes looks very ordinary. Making a meal, sitting quietly beside someone, helping with paperwork, listening to the same memory for the 5th time without becoming impatient, checking on someone after everyone else has gone home. These actions may not look mystical, but they embody Dharma. And Dharma matters because spirituality is not only what you believe about invisible worlds, it is how you behave in the visible one. This is another reason the 7th night can become a test for the living. The first days are often filled with visitors. People come, they call, they offer condolences. The home is busy, but eventually the crowd becomes smaller. Then the real loneliness begins. The family wakes after several days and realizes ordinary life is returning for everyone else, but not for them. This is when support becomes especially important. The grieving person may feel forgotten precisely when the shock is beginning to wear off. So if you know someone who has lost a loved one, Do not only appear during the first day, remember them later, after the crowd leaves, after the ritual ends, after everyone else returns to routine. That may be when your presence matters most. There is something deeply beautiful about this because it transforms a teaching about death into a teaching about community. Perhaps the soul's symbolic journey toward release is accompanied by the living learning how to carry one another. The deceased is no longer physically available to fill their old role, so the community responds. Someone else helps, someone else listens, someone else provides. Life reorganizes itself through care. This is how loss reveals interconnectedness. We often live as though we are completely independent. Then death occurs, and suddenly the family discovers how many invisible threads held everyday life together. The person who died may have been doing things no one noticed. They handled money, called certain relatives, prepared food, remembered birthdays, fixed things, kept peace. Their absence reveals their contribution. This too can become gratitude. Instead of only saying, "Why are you gone?" the family begins understanding, "I did not realize how much you were giving while you were here." That recognition can transform grief. The person becomes more than the moment of death. Their entire life returns to view. This is important because early grief can make death overshadow everything else. The last hospital room, the final breath, the funeral, the body, the painful images, these can dominate memory, but a person was more than their death. They had years of ordinary life, their laughter, their mistakes, their habits, their jokes, their sacrifices, their kindness, their difficult moments, their growth. Their story should not be reduced to the way it ended. Before the seventh night, perhaps the family can begin gently recovering the whole person from beneath the shock of death. Tell stories, remember something funny, speak about what they taught you. Remember their imperfections with tenderness. This allows memory to become human again. That is another form of release. You release the person from being only the one who died. They become once again the one who lived. This shift can be enormously healing. And perhaps it mirrors the spiritual idea at the heart of this audiobook. Death is a transition, not simply a single shocking event. For the living, memory also transitions, from shock toward grief, from grief toward remembrance, from remembrance perhaps eventually toward gratitude. None of this follows a perfect schedule. 7 days do not erase grief. 7 months may not erase it. Even 7 years may not erase it. The number is a threshold, not a deadline. This must be understood. Nobody should feel spiritually inadequate because they are still crying after a particular number of days. Grief is not a timetable. Love has different depths, circumstances, and histories. The symbolism of the seventh night is not telling you, you must be over this now. It is asking, can something begin changing now? Even slightly. Can panic become remembrance? Can guilt become learning? Can possession become gratitude? Can fear become trust? Can the question, why did this happen, slowly make room for, how will I live because this happened? That is the transformation. This brings us to one of the deepest responsibilities of the living. Do not turn remembrance into a shrine to suffering. There is a difference between honoring someone and believing you must remain miserable to prove you loved them. Sometimes grieving people feel guilty when they laugh again. They feel guilty when they enjoy food, guilty when they sleep peacefully, guilty when they celebrate something. They think happiness means betrayal. But love does not ask you to destroy the rest of your life as proof that the person mattered. Continuing is not forgetting. Healing is not disloyalty. Laughing again does not erase grief. The living are allowed to live. This may be one of the greatest acts of release around the seventh night. You begin giving yourself permission to continue. Not quickly, not artificially, but honestly, and within the Vedic-inspired symbolic framework. Perhaps this permission carries its own beauty. The family does not pull backward through endless refusal. They honor, remember, and slowly allow movement. This is why a peaceful blessing can contain so much power, not because words mechanically control the afterlife, but because they transform the heart of the person speaking them. A grieving heart may slowly move from "do not leave me" toward "I love you and I release what I cannot keep." That is enormous. The sentence itself changes the relationship with loss. And perhaps this is the sixth golden truth of the soul's seventh night. The days after death are not only about what may be happening to the soul. They are also about whether the living can learn to transform love from desperate possession into peaceful remembrance. That is the real preparation for the seventh night. Remember without obsession, grieve without shame, honor without fear. Perform meaningful practices without turning them into superstition. Support the family. Resolve unnecessary conflict. Let guilt become wisdom. Let memory become gratitude. And most importantly, let death change the way you treat those who are still alive. Because one day another chair will be empty. Another phone will stop ringing. Another voice will become memory. Perhaps yours, perhaps someone you love. You do not know. That uncertainty is not meant to terrify you. It is meant to awaken you. Say the important thing now. Make the call now. Forgive what deserves forgiveness now. Sit beside the person now. Listen now. Because when the seventh night eventually arrives, the one thing everyone wishes they had more of is rarely money, status, or possessions. It is time. And while you are alive, time is still being placed in your hands. Chapter 7. The Seventh Night. When the journey may begin facing forward, the seventh night carries a different emotional weight. By now, the first shock has begun to change. The home still feels strange. The family still feels the absence. The memories are still vivid. The unfinished desires have not magically disappeared. The attachment to identity, relationship, body, and place may still feel powerful, but something has shifted. The death is no longer only an event that happened. It has started becoming reality, and within the Vedic-inspired framework of this audiobook, perhaps the seventh night can be understood as the moment when the soul's orientation begins changing from what was left behind toward what may come next. Not because 7 days act like a supernatural switch, not because every soul follows one identical timetable, but because 7 nights can symbolize the completion of an initial cycle, a threshold where the old world has become impossible to return to in the same form. This is where the journey becomes deeper. The first days may be imagined as filled with familiarity: the house, the family, the body, the name, the routines, the unfinished plans, the emotional pull of the life that just ended. But by the seventh night, perhaps the grip of those impressions has begun to loosen enough for a new question to arise. If I cannot return to what I was, what remains now? That question is more powerful than it first appears, because most people spend an entire lifetime constructing identity from things that cannot survive death in the same form: a body, a job, a reputation, a family role, a social position, a history, a future imagined but not yet lived. Then death comes and strips away the structure. You are no longer the person who wakes in that room. You are no longer the person who drives to that workplace. You are no longer the person whose phone receives those messages. You are no longer the person whose physical presence shapes the household in the same way. So what remains? Within Vedic-inspired traditions, this is where the conversation moves toward consciousness, samskaras, karma, tendencies, attachments, and the deeper impressions formed through a lifetime of choices. The outer story becomes less central. The inner pattern becomes more important. This is why the seventh night can be imagined as a profound threshold. The soul may no longer be able to define itself only by what it had. The question may begin shifting toward what it became. That is a very different kind of identity. A person may have owned much, but did they cultivate generosity? They may have been respected, but did they cultivate humility? They may have been powerful, but did they cultivate compassion? They may have been loved, but did they know how to love without possession? They may have spoken about spirituality, but did they actually live with awareness? This is where death becomes brutally clarifying. Titles disappear, possessions remain behind, social comparisons lose meaning. The image others had of you becomes irrelevant to your own inner journey. What remains meaningful is the quality of consciousness you practiced. This does not mean there is a measurable cosmic scorecard we can observe, but as a spiritual lens, the principle is powerful. You become what you repeatedly practice. If you practice anger, anger deepens. If you practice fear, fear becomes familiar. If you practice compassion, compassion becomes more available. If you practice non-attachment, release becomes less foreign. This is why the seventh night may symbolize not only movement, but exposure. The outer supports are gone. The habits of consciousness stand more naked. A person can no longer hide behind roles, no longer hide behind possessions, no longer hide behind the way others saw them. The internal tendencies matter more. This should make the living uncomfortable in a useful way, because right now, while alive, it is easy to avoid this question. You can distract yourself, stay busy, build more, earn more, compare more, argue more, scroll more, prove more. But death removes distraction. The seventh night symbolically asks, what remains when there is nothing left to perform? That question can change a life. Perhaps you think you are kind because people call you kind, but are you kind when nobody sees? Perhaps you think you are spiritual because you talk about deep ideas, but are you peaceful when you are disappointed? Perhaps you think you are detached because you understand the concept. But what happens when something you love is taken away? The seventh night metaphor exposes the difference between spiritual language and spiritual formation. Knowledge is one thing, character is another. This is why the soul's journey should not be reduced to curiosity about invisible worlds. The deeper purpose is to ask what kind of consciousness is being formed now. Every day you are practicing something. You are practicing how to react, how to desire, how to forgive, how to hold, how to release, how to love, how to suffer, how to respond when life does not obey you. These are not small habits. They become character, and character becomes the deepest evidence of what you actually value. This is where the seventh night can become the strongest chapter in the entire audiobook. Because until now, we have been asking what may happen after death. Now the question turns toward the living. What are you practicing before death? If the soul may eventually have to release everything temporary, are you practicing release? If the soul may eventually stand without social identity, do you know who you are without approval? If possessions cannot follow you, why are you destroying your peace to collect more than you need? If relationships change form, why are you wasting years refusing to say what matters? If death is certain but timing is uncertain, why do you live as if important things can always be postponed? This is not about becoming afraid. It is about becoming awake. Fear says, death is coming, panic. Wisdom says, death is coming, live properly. That difference matters. A spiritually mature person does not obsess over death. They let awareness of death sharpen life. They become more honest, more present, more grateful, less interested in meaningless drama, less willing to waste years in resentment, more willing to love without delaying. This is what the seventh night should awaken in you. Perhaps the soul, symbolically, is beginning to face forward, and perhaps you should too. Not toward death, toward a more conscious life. Because one of the deepest mistakes people make is thinking spiritual teachings about death are meant only for people who are dying. They are not. They are for people who are still alive enough to change. The seventh night asks, what would you change if you knew how temporary everything was? Would you still hold that grudge? Would you still avoid that conversation? Would you still spend so much energy trying to impress people who will one day disappear from your life? Would you still sacrifice health for status? Would you still ignore the people who love you because you assume they will always be there? These questions reveal priorities, and priorities reveal attachment. This is where the relationship between karma and the seventh night becomes powerful. Karma is often misunderstood as some mysterious punishment that waits for people later. But karma can also be understood through the much simpler principle of action and consequence. Every action has an effect. Every repeated action shapes tendency. Every tendency influences future choices. If you lie repeatedly, deception becomes easier. If you forgive repeatedly, forgiveness becomes more available. If you feed envy, envy becomes part of your inner world. If you practice gratitude, gratitude deepens. This is how life shapes consciousness. And within traditions that accept continuation beyond death, the idea becomes even more significant. Perhaps the body ends, but the pattern you cultivated is not meaningless. Again, this is a spiritual belief, not something we can prove directly, but as an ethical teaching, it is profound. It says, "Do not wait for the end to become the person you already know you should be. Practice now. If you want peace at the end, practice peace before the end. If you want release, practice release. If you want clarity, stop feeding confusion. If you want love to remain clean, stop mixing it with control." This is where the seventh night becomes almost like a mirror held in front of the living. You are watching the soul symbolically move beyond the world of possession. So ask yourself how possessed you are. Possessed by what? By approval? By money? By anger? By a relationship? By status? By fear? By regret? By the need to control everything? Anything you believe you cannot exist without has power over you. That is the definition of bondage. And perhaps the deeper Vedic lesson is freedom. Freedom does not mean owning nothing. Freedom means nothing temporary owns your consciousness completely. You can have wealth without worshipping wealth. You can have relationships without becoming dependent on control. You can enjoy comfort without believing comfort is your identity. You can be respected without needing respect to survive emotionally. This is the kind of inner freedom that becomes meaningful when the outer world changes, because the seventh night, symbolically, is all about change. The familiar life has ended. The direction is shifting. The soul may be imagined as beginning to face something it cannot fully understand. This is where trust becomes important. Human beings want maps. We want exact answers. Where is the soul? What does it see? What happens next? When does rebirth happen? What changes on which day? But spiritual humility may require accepting that not every invisible detail is available to us. Perhaps the purpose is not to know every stage. Perhaps the purpose is to understand the principles: impermanence, attachment, karma, samskara, dharma, awareness. These are usable now. A map of the invisible may satisfy curiosity. A principle can transform behavior. This is why the seventh night should not end in speculation alone. It should end in action. If death teaches impermanence, live more gratefully. If death teaches that possessions cannot stay, hold them lightly. If death teaches that relationships can end suddenly, become more present. If death teaches that unfinished words may remain in memory, speak the important ones. If death teaches that control is limited, practice humility. This is how the seventh night becomes relevant before your own death. And there is another important lesson. The soul, within this symbolic journey, may begin facing forward, but that does not mean the past becomes meaningless. Moving forward is not the same as erasing the past. A lifetime matters because it shaped consciousness. Relationships matter because they created impressions. Love matters because it changed people. Pain matters because it revealed something. Mistakes matter because they created consequences. But the past becomes a teacher rather than a prison. This is one of the deepest shifts. At first, Memory says, "This is what happened to me." Later, wisdom asks, "What did this teach me?" At first, attachment says, "I cannot leave this behind." Later, awareness says, "What can I carry forward without carrying the chain?" This is how the past transforms. You do not need to carry every wound. You can carry the lesson. You do not need to carry every regret. You can carry greater awareness. You do not need to carry the need to possess someone. You can carry love. You do not need to carry an entire identity. You can carry the qualities that became deeply rooted in consciousness. This may be one possible way to understand the transition beyond the seventh night. Not that everything is erased, but that the essence becomes more important than the form. The house fades as identity, but perhaps the attachment pattern matters. The relationship fades as physical role, but perhaps the love and lessons remain meaningful. The social title fades, but the character formed under that title has already shaped consciousness. This is why the seventh night can feel like the border between biography and essence. The biography says, "I lived here. I belong to these people. I worked there. I achieved this. I suffered that." The deeper question asks, what did all of it make me? That may be the question that survives every chapter, and this should change the way you think about success. Success is usually measured outwardly. How much did you earn? How much did you own? How many people knew your name? What did you achieve? But imagine measuring success from the seventh night. Would the same things matter? Perhaps the better questions would be, did you become wiser? Did you become less cruel? Did you learn how to forgive? Did you reduce unnecessary suffering around you? Did you become more aware? Did the people closest to you feel loved? Did you live according to your deepest values? Those questions feel different because they cannot be displayed. They cannot always be photographed, but they may matter far more when the outer life ends. This is one reason people often change after coming close to death. Priorities suddenly become clear. They realize how much time was spent on things that did not deserve it. They become less impressed by status, more interested in time, more interested in relationships, more interested in being alive consciously. You do not need to wait for a crisis to gain that clarity. The seventh night contemplation can give it to you now. Ask yourself what you would stop doing if you fully accepted that your time was limited. Then ask why you are still doing it. Ask what you would begin doing if you knew the people around you would not always be here. Then ask why you are waiting. This is where philosophy becomes practical. Death awareness without action is only thought. Death awareness with action becomes wisdom. And perhaps this is exactly what the seventh night symbolizes. The soul, within this spiritual imagination, is no longer merely confronting an ending. It is confronting direction. What comes next? That question has power precisely because the old answer is gone. You cannot say, "I will return to my usual routine." The usual routine has ended. You cannot say, "I will deal with this later." The old form of later is gone. Perhaps that is when consciousness becomes more exposed to its own tendencies. If there is deep attachment, attachment becomes visible. If there is fear, fear becomes visible. If there is acceptance, acceptance becomes meaningful. If there is spiritual awareness, perhaps it becomes a resource. This is another reason spiritual practice matters before death. Meditation, contemplation, self-observation, ethical living, disciplined action, and non-attachment are not decorations added to life. They train the mind. A trained mind responds differently from an untrained one. If you practice being aware of thoughts without believing every thought, then fear may not control you as completely. If you practice accepting change, change becomes less shocking. If you practice humility, loss of status becomes less devastating. These are practical consequences. Perhaps this is the real preparation for the unknown, not memorizing a perfect description of what happens afterward. Developing a consciousness that can meet change with greater clarity. This is why the seventh chapter must return repeatedly to the living. The soul's seventh night may remain mysterious. Your current day is not mysterious. You know you are alive. You know there are people you need to treat better. You know there are habits you need to examine. You know there are attachments that control you. You know there are things you keep postponing. That is where responsibility lies. Do not use spiritual curiosity as a substitute for spiritual work. It is easier to ask, where does the soul go, than to ask, why am I still carrying this hatred? It is easier to study rebirth than to change one harmful habit. It is easier to imagine mystical journeys than to apologize. But the difficult work is the real work. This is Dharma, the present responsibility, the action that belongs to you now. And perhaps this is what the seventh night ultimately teaches. The soul cannot remain indefinitely inside the old story, and neither should you. Maybe there is an old identity you need to release while still alive, the identity of being the victim forever, the identity of being the one who must always win, the identity of being the one who cannot change, the identity built around one failure, one rejection, one betrayal, one relationship. People carry dead identities for years. The event ended long ago, but the identity remains. I am the person they abandoned. I am the person who failed. I am the person who was betrayed. These become invisible graves, and life continues while part of the person remains emotionally buried in the past. The seventh night lesson says, you can honor what happened without living there forever. You can carry wisdom forward. You can leave the prison behind. This is exactly the same movement we have been exploring symbolically for the soul. From backward orientation to forward movement. From identification with what was to openness toward what comes next. Perhaps that movement is not only after death, perhaps it is the pattern of every genuine transformation. Something ends, you grieve, you resist, you hold. Eventually you realize the old form cannot return. Then you face forward. This is why death is the ultimate symbol of transition, but not the only one. Every meaningful change contains a smaller version of this journey. The end of a relationship, the loss of a career, leaving a home, growing older, a child leaving, an identity changing. Each one asks, can you release what ended without losing what it taught you? That is spiritual maturity. And perhaps this is the seventh golden truth of the soul's seventh night. The greatest change after 7 days may not be that the soul forgets the life it lived. It may be that the old life is no longer the only direction consciousness can face. That is the turning. The family remains behind, but love does not have to become bondage. The home remains behind, but belonging does not have to be limited to walls. The body remains behind, but identity may no longer be confined to physical form within this spiritual framework. The unfinished desires remain part of the story, but the demand to complete every one of them may begin weakening. The past remains meaningful, but forward movement becomes possible. And perhaps that is what the seventh night truly symbolizes. Not disappearance, not forgetting, not punishment. Movement. The soul may begin moving toward whatever lies beyond the life it knew, while the living begin moving toward a life permanently changed by its absence. Both journeys require release, both require humility, both require acceptance that the old form cannot continue forever. And that is why this chapter belongs not only to someone who has died, it belongs to you. Because perhaps there is something in your own life whose seventh night has already arrived. Something ended. You know it ended, but you are still standing at the doorway, waiting for it to return. A person, a version of yourself, a dream, a relationship, a past, and perhaps the deeper lesson of death is whispering to you now. You do not need to pretend it never mattered. You do not need to erase it. You do not need to hate it. But you may need to turn. You may need to face forward. Because there comes a point when holding the past does not honor it anymore. It only prevents the next step. And perhaps when the soul reaches its symbolic seventh night, This is the truth it begins to meet. What was loved can remain meaningful without remaining the place where the journey stops. That is the doorway. Behind it is the life that ended. Ahead of it is mystery. And perhaps the deepest act of spiritual courage is not knowing exactly where the path leads. It is becoming willing to take the next step anyway. Perhaps you began this audiobook wanting one answer: what changes for the soul after 7 days? But by now, the deeper truth should be clear. The seventh night may not be about one exact invisible event happening to every soul at the same moment. It may represent something far more meaningful: the beginning of release, the weakening of attachment, the turning away from what can no longer be held, and the movement toward what comes next. The body is left behind, the home is left behind, possessions are left behind. Possessions are left behind. Roles are left behind. Even the name that once seemed permanent eventually becomes memory. And this is why death is not only a mystery about the dead, it is a warning to the living. You are holding things today that one day you will have to release. You are arguing about things you cannot keep. You are postponing words you may not always have time to say. You are building plans as though tomorrow has already been promised to you. But the seventh night whispers something different. Hold gently, love deeply, live consciously. Do not wait until someone becomes a memory before realizing how much they mattered. Do not wait until your body weakens before appreciating another ordinary morning. Do not wait until your home becomes silent before becoming grateful for the voices inside it. And do not wait until your own final days to ask whether the life you built actually reflected what mattered to you. If Vedic-inspired wisdom teaches anything through the mystery of death, perhaps it is this: what you possess matters less than what possession makes you become. What you experience matters less than the consciousness you cultivate through it. And what you love should make you more awake, not more imprisoned by fear. Perhaps the soul's seventh night is therefore not frightening. Perhaps it is a doorway. Behind it is one completed chapter. Ahead is mystery, and somewhere between the two, attachment may begin turning into acceptance. For the departed, within this spiritual lens, that may mean facing forward. For you, it means something even more immediate. You are still here. You still have a voice. You still have time to apologize, time to forgive, time to become less controlled by resentment, time to sit beside the people you love, time to simplify what has become unnecessarily heavy, time to live your dharma with greater awareness. One day, the things around you will belong to someone else, but the way you lived among them is being written into you now. So when you close the soul's seventh night, do not leave with fear about death, leave with clarity about life. Because perhaps the most important question was never, what changes after 7 days? Perhaps it was always, what must change in me before my own final night arrives? And if this journey has shown you anything, let it be this: love what is here, release what must go. And while life is still asking something from you, do not remain asleep inside it.